Welcome to the Bookish Breakdown. I'm Lem.
And I'm Abby. There is a ton of speculation about today's topic.
Was this a government cover-up? I believe very little I hear these days from the mainstream media spin doctors.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of folks feel that way. And you know what? We're going to dive into all of that.
Wait, all right.
The evidence, the conspiracies.
All of that.
But before we get into all that juicy stuff,
Yeah,
we need to make sure everyone listening is starting off on the same page.
of course.
So Ruby Ridge, for those of you who haven't heard of it
Yeah?
or need a refresher, took place in 1992 in Boundary County, Idaho,
Right up in the mountains.
in a very remote area.
Extremely remote.
Randy Weaver, his wife, Vicky, and their kids
Yeah.
were living a very, very isolated life.
And they weren't always like that, right? I mean, we've got excerpts from the book Ruby Ridge, The Truth and Tragedy of the Randy Weaver Family,
Right.
to help us understand how they went from a seemingly ordinary family in Iowa to this remote life in Idaho and ultimately to a deadly standoff with federal agents.
Exactly. And it's a truly fascinating and tragic story. So the Weavers, they weren't always so isolated.
Right.
Randy served in the military and was very proud of his father. Vicky was raised with strict religious beliefs, and as they got older, their faith deepened.
And so did their disillusionment with society and the government.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
They became increasingly drawn to radical ideologies.
Specifically Christian identity.
Exactly, which is a belief system that promotes, to put it simply, white supremacy and anti-Semitism.
Okay, so not your average family next door.
No, not at all.
Got it.
And their embrace of these beliefs ultimately played a huge role in their decision to isolate themselves and their growing distrust of the government.
So they basically saw the government as the enemy.
Pretty much, yeah. They believed they were preparing for a coming race war.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack, but it's really important context for us to understand,
I agree.
to even make sense of their actions later on.
Exactly. It's not about condoning their beliefs, but rather trying to grasp their motivations.
Right. And to complicate matters even further, Randy got tangled up with the ATF through an informant named Kenneth Fadley.
Oh, yeah, this whole episode was like pouring gasoline on their paranoia.
Okay, so before we go any further,
Yes.
if you're enjoying this deep dive into Ruby Ridge, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel.
We really appreciate it.
All right, now back to Randy and the ATF. What happened there?
Well, Fadley was an informant tasked with infiltrating extremist groups.
Right.
And through a mutual acquaintance, he ended up meeting Randy.
Okay.
And according to the book, the ATF used some really questionable tactics in their interactions with Randy.
Like what?
Well, they pressured him into selling sawed-off shotguns to Fadley.
Shorter than the legal limit, right?
Right. And then they used that as leverage against him.
So basically they entrapped him.
That's exactly how Randy felt, and to him, this just proved that the government was deliberately targeting him.
And this is all before the standoff even happens.
Yeah, so you can imagine how this just fueled his mistrust of the government.
Right. He already believed they were out to get him, and now he had what he believed was proof.
Exactly, and when he refused to appear in court on those weapons charges,
Things really escalated.
big time, the Weavers, already feeling persecuted, were now convinced the government was coming after them.
I'm starting to see how this all spiraled out of control, but before we get into the standoff itself,
Yeah.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around their life up on Ruby Ridge.
It was pretty intense.
I mean, living off the grid, no electricity, no running water.
They were raising their kids, homeschooling them, preparing for what they believed was an inevitable societal collapse.
Wow, talk about a different way of life. Did they have any contact with the outside world at all?
They had limited contact with neighbors and would go into town sometimes for supplies.
So they weren't completely cut off.
No.
Interesting. And get this, Randy even considered running for sheriff at one point.
I know, right? Wild.
It really shows you the contradictions within their story, you know.
Absolutely. They were fiercely independent, but also yearned for a sense of belonging in their community.
But in the end, their distrust of the government led them down a path of isolation and conflict.
And tragically, that path would lead to a confrontation that changed their lives and the national conversation forever.
A confrontation that we're going to dive into right after this quick break. Stay tuned, because we've got more insights into the Ruby Ridge standoff coming up. And don't forget, we have a very special free gift for everyone who stays until the end of the video.
So the ATF had tried everything to get Randy to cooperate, and he just wouldn't budge.
He was totally convinced they were out to get him.
Yeah, and he wasn't entirely wrong to be suspicious. you know?
Mhm.
After Randy failed to appear in court on those weapons charges, the U.S. Marshals got involved.
Okay.
And they were tasked with apprehending him. But this wasn't your typical arrest warrant situation. They launched a full-blown surveillance operation.
Really?
Yeah, it was called Operation Northern Exposure. They were monitoring the Weaver family nonstop. They had hidden cameras, listening devices, even infrared sensors.
Hold on a sec. I get that he skipped bail and had a stockpile of weapons,
Right.
but this level of surveillance seems a bit excessive, don't you think? I mean, they were living way up in the mountains,
Yeah.
seemingly not posing any immediate threat to anyone.
Well, that's one of the big questions surrounding Ruby Ridge.
Yeah.
The marshals argued that Randy was dangerous and had ties to extremist groups.
Which wasn't entirely inaccurate, right?
Right. Remember those Christian identity gatherings we talked about?
The Aryan Nations Congresses, yeah.
Exactly.
But still, did they really need to go to such lengths? It almost feels like they were looking for a confrontation.
That's a perspective a lot of people share, especially those who believe the government was deliberately targeting the Weavers.
Right, right.
And tragically, the situation did escalate on August 21st, 1992. A team of marshals went up to Ruby Ridge to scout the area.
So they were basically engaging in a military-style operation.
Essentially, yes, and they were armed, wearing camouflage the whole 9 yards.
And that's when they encountered Randy's son, Sammy.
And Kevin Harris, a friend who was staying with the Weavers.
Out in the woods, right?
Yeah.
And wasn't Sammy just a teenager at the time?
He was only 14 years old.
Oh my gosh.
Now, according to the marshals' accounts, the Weaver family dog Striker started barking, which alerted the group to their presence.
Oh no.
And shots were fired.
It's still unclear who fired the first shot, right?
It's highly debated to this day.
But in the chaos, Sammy was killed, and so is U.S. Marshal William Deacon.
Yeah.
That's awful. Just a horrible tragedy for everyone involved.
Absolutely. It was a complete disaster that set off a chain of events with devastating consequences.
So after the initial shootout, what happened?
The remaining marshals retreated, and the FBI was called in to handle the now full-blown standoff.
Okay, so things have gone from bad to worse.
Right.
We've got a dead U.S. Marshal, a 14-year-old boy is dead, and Randy Weaver is holed up in his cabin with his family, believing the government is out to get him.
Right. It was a tense situation.
So what happens next?
The FBI brought in their elite hostage rescue team, the HRT.
The same unit that was later involved in the Waco siege.
That's right. Ruby Ridge was all over the news, and the pressure was on to resolve the situation quickly.
You would think they'd try to de-escalate things at that point.
You'd think so. But instead, the FBI seemed to double down. They brought in armored vehicles, set up sniper positions, and most controversially, they implemented modified rules of engagement.
Okay, what were these modified rules of engagement and why were they so controversial?
Well, these rules essentially gave FBI snipers permission to shoot any armed adult on site without warning.
Whoa, hold on. Normally, deadly force is only authorized if there's an imminent threat to life.
Right. Exactly. But in this case, the rules were much looser.
So they were basically giving snipers a license to kill.
That's how a lot of people saw it, and these modified rules would have fatal consequences.
Oh, no.
On August 22nd, Randy, Vicky, and their daughters were trying to get to a shed where Sammy's body was laid out.
This is just heartbreaking.
Sniper Lon Hariuchi fired 2 shots.
Oh, my gosh.
One bullet grazed Randy's arm, the other fatally struck Vicky.
No.
She was standing in the doorway of the cabin, holding her baby daughter.
Shooting at a woman holding an infant. It just seems so senseless. What was the FBI's justification for that?
The FBI claimed that Horiuchi believed Vicky posed a threat because she was near a door where Randy had previously been seen armed.
Come on, she was holding a baby.
Well, yeah.
It just adds to the whole perception of government overreach and disregard for human life.
You're right. Vicky's death really fueled the public outrage over this whole thing.
So what happened after Vicky was killed? Did the standoff end there?
No, the siege continued for several more days.
That must have been a nightmare for them. I can't even imagine.
It was a horrific situation for everyone involved. The standoff finally ended on August 31st when a former Green Beret named Bo Gritz stepped in to negotiate the surrender.
Wait, Bo Gritz, wasn't he involved in some controversial stuff himself?
He definitely had his own share of controversies, but he was also a skilled negotiator, and he managed to build a rapport with Randy Weaver. He convinced him to come out peacefully with his daughters, and Kevin Harris also surrendered.
It's amazing that he was able to gain Randy's trust.
Yeah, I think the Weavers felt more comfortable dealing with someone outside of the government.
Right, someone they didn't see as a threat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Gritz played a critical role in bringing the standoff to a peaceful end, But even though the siege itself was over, the story of Ruby Ridge was far from finished.
The trials, the investigations, the lasting impact on American society were only just beginning. We're back. And, after that standoff ended, things didn't exactly quiet down.
Oh, no, not at all. The legal battles and the search for answers were just getting started.
Right, it became this huge media frenzy.
It really did. You had these clashing ideologies, high-powered legal teams, and the whole nation was watching, trying to make sense of what happened up on that mountain.
It felt like a real turning point in how we think about government power and individual rights.
I agree.
But before we get into those bigger questions, let's recap the legal proceedings.
Sure.
What were the specific charges against Randy and Kevin?
Well, Rand was hit with a ton of charges, including murder, conspiracy, and weapons violations.
Wow.
And Kevin Harris was also charged with murder in the death of Marshall Deegan.
So very serious charges.
Very serious.
And they both had some pretty impressive legal representation, right?
They did. Randy had Jerry Spence on his side.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Spence was like a legal rock star known for his charisma and ability to connect with juries.
Yeah, he was a master storyteller.
He really was. And he painted Randy as a victim of government persecution.
I read some of Spence's books,
Oh, yeah.
and he definitely knows how to make a compelling case. What about Kevin Harris's defense?
Kevin was represented by David Nevin,
Who is known
for his
right.
super meticulous legal strategies.
So less flashy than Spence, but equally brilliant.
Exactly. Nevin focused on really picking apart the prosecution's case, highlighting inconsistencies and raising doubts about the FBI's actions.
So two very different legal styles, but both aimed at achieving the same goal, proving their clients were not guilty.
Right.
What were some of the key arguments that were presented during these trials?
Well, the trials really dug deep into, everything. The events leading up to the standoff, the shootout, the controversial rules of engagement used by the FBI.
Yeah.
The prosecution argued that Randy was responsible for escalating the situation by refusing to appear in court and resisting arrest. They painted him as a dangerous anti-government extremist who had basically provoked a confrontation with law enforcement.
But the defense had a counterargument to that, right?
Oh, absolutely. They argued that the government had entrapped Randy with those sawed-off shotgun charges,
Right.
using shady tactics to pressure him into committing a crime.
And that the ATF's actions were a violation of Randy's rights?
Exactly, and they said he was justified in fearing for his safety and the safety of his family.
So basically, they were saying that the whole situation was a result of government overreach and that it led to a tragedy that could have been avoided.
Precisely. And they also argued that the FBI's use of excessive force, especially those modified rules of engagement, were a clear indication that they were more interested in punishing the Weavers than in peacefully resolving the standoff.
And of course, Vicki Weaver's death became a focal point in the trials.
It did.
How did each side address that tragedy?
The prosecution tried to downplay the significance of Vicky's death,
Really?
Yeah, they argued that it was just an unfortunate consequence of Randy Weaver's actions.
So they still blamed Randy.
Yeah, they maintained that the FBI sniper was justified in believing she posed a threat.
Which, as we discussed, is a very hard argument to swallow.
Hmm.
I mean, she was holding a baby.
Right.
How did the defense respond to that?
The defense was relentless in highlighting the injustice of Vicky's death.
Good.
They argued that the rules of engagement were reckless and illegal, and that the FBI sniper had acted with negligence, if not malice.
Wow, must have been so emotional for everyone involved.
It was a very charged atmosphere. The jury deliberated for weeks, carefully considering all the evidence and testimony. And when the verdicts finally came down, it was a mixed bag.
It was. Okay, so let's get to those verdicts.
Yeah.
What was the outcome?
Well, Randy Weaver was acquitted on the most serious charges,
Okay.
including murder, but he was found guilty of failing to appear in court on the original weapons charges.
Okay.
Kevin Harris was acquitted on all charges, including the murder of Marshall Deegan.
So in a way, both sides could claim some victory.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
The government secured a conviction on at least one charge against Randy, but they failed to get a conviction on the more serious charges
Right.
related to the shootout.
And for a lot of people, those acquittals, were seen as a rejection of the government's tactics and a vindication of the right to self-defense.
I could definitely see how these verdicts fuel the debate about the role of government and the limits of its power. But the trials were only one chapter in this whole Ruby Ridge saga, right?
Right after the trials, there were all these investigations and congressional hearings into what happened at Ruby Ridge.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
The FBI was basically forced to admit to serious mistakes in its handling of the standoff, including the use of those modified rules of engagement.
So there was at least some acknowledgement of wrongdoing.
There was, but for many it wasn't enough. The Weaver family filed a civil lawsuit against the government and eventually received a $3.1 million settlement.
That's a significant amount.
Hmm.
But can any amount of money truly compensate for the loss of life and the trauma they experienced?
That's a great question, and it speaks to this larger issue of accountability. While the financial settlement provided some measure of justice, it didn't bring back Sammy or Vicky Weaver, and nobody within the government was ever held criminally responsible for their deaths.
Which is something that continues to haunt this case.
It does, and that's why Ruby Ridge continues to resonate with people. Even today, it raises questions about the balance between individual rights and government power,
Yeah.
about the use of deadly force, and about the very nature of justice itself.
It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our history and to ask ourselves how we can prevent such tragedies from happening again.
It really is.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone deep into the events leading up to the Ruby Ridge standoff, the tragic deaths of Sammy and Vicky Weaver, the controversial tactics used by the FBI, the trials of Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris, and the lasting impact of this event on American society.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It's a complex story with no easy answers. But I hope this deep dive has provided some insights and perspectives for you.
Me too.
And before we wrap up, I just want to remind everyone about that special free gift we have for you. So be sure to check that out in the description below.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
And as always, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.